The wind howled across the cracked and barren surface of Seven, carrying with it clouds of red dust that swirled like restless spirits. The planet was a wasteland, its once blue skies now stained with the color of rust, its soil dry and lifeless. Humanity's last colony clung to survival here, tucked into a narrow valley between jagged mountains where the air was marginally breathable. It was not much of a home, but it was all they had left. Jack Monroe tightened the straps on his backpack and adjusted the oxygen mask over his face. He stood at the edge of the colony's perimeter fence, staring out into the endless expanse of nothingness. His boots crunched against the brittle ground as he shifted his weight, impatient to leave. Jack wasn't one for waiting. He never had been. Behind him, Dawson leaned against the doorway of the command center, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched Jack with a mixture of concern and frustration. "You don't have to do this alone," she said finally, her voice cutting through the static of the wind. "We can send someone else." Jack didn't turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw clenched. "I'm doing this," he replied flatly, "and I'll do it alone." Sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing further. Jack was stubborn, maybe even reckless, but he was also the best scout the colony had. If anyone could reach the old research facility buried deep within the toxic plains, it was him. Still, sending him out there without backup felt wrong. The facility was miles away from the safety of the colony, surrounded by treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather patterns. Not to mention the rumors, whispers of strange things moving in the shadows, things no one had ever seen clearly enough to explain. "Fine," said after a pause. Her tone softened slightly, though her worry remained evident. "Just be careful, okay?" Jack gave a curt nod but said nothing. He didn't need reassurance. He didn't need advice. He'd been surviving on his own long before the colony existed, and he wasn't about to start doubting himself now. With one last glance back at the cluster of domes and prefab structures that made up their fragile settlement, Jack stepped forward, leaving the relative safety of the fence behind. The first hour of his journey passed uneventfully. The landscape stretched out endlessly before him, featureless except for the occasional rock formation jutting up like broken teeth. Jack moved quickly, his pace steady despite the heavy pack on his shoulders. Every few minutes, he checked his wrist-mounted navigation device, ensuring he was still heading in the right direction. The research facility wasn't marked on any official maps. It had been abandoned decades ago, long before the colony arrived, but its coordinates were etched into the device's memory. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, Jack began to notice something odd. At first, it was just a feeling, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck as if he were being watched. He stopped walking and turned slowly, scanning the horizon. Nothing moved. The wind continued to whistle past, stirring up eddies of dust that danced briefly before settling again. Shaking his head, Jack told himself it was nothing, just nerves. But then he saw it. A faint impression in the dirt, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Footsteps, or at least something that resembled footsteps. They were too large to belong to a human, and their edges were uneven, almost claw-like. Jack crouched down to examine them more closely, running a gloved finger along the groove left in the soil. Whatever had made these tracks wasn't far away. For a moment, doubt crept into Jack's mind. He'd always prided himself on his ability to handle anything the universe threw at him, but this was different. There was something unnatural about those prints, something that logic. He shook off the thought almost immediately. Fear wouldn't get him anywhere. Standing up, he straightened his posture and resumed his march, muttering under his breath, "I can handle this alone." To Jack, he was indeed being followed. 10 steps behind him, silent as death, the cub padded softly across the ground. Its sleek metallic frame blended seamlessly with the shadows, its movements so fluid and precise that it seemed almost alive. The cub had been activated remotely by, who couldn't bear the idea of sending Jack out into the unknown without some form of protection. Though programmed to assist, the cub was designed to remain undetected unless absolutely necessary. For now, it simply observed, analyzing every step Jack took and every decision he made. Hours passed, and the sun sank completely below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness. Jack switched on the lamp attached to his helmet, its beam cutting through the gloom. The temperature dropped rapidly, and frost began to form on the rocks around him. He pulled his coat around his body, shivering slightly despite the layers of insulation. This part of 7 was colder than most, a fact he hadn't fully accounted for when planning his route. As he trudged onward, the sense of being followed grew stronger. Jack glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, but each time he saw only empty space. Still, the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, he stopped and called out into the night. "Who's there?" His voice echoed eerily, swallowed by the vast emptiness. There was no response. Only the wind answered, moaning softly as it swept through the desolation. Jack frowned, gripping the hilt of the knife strapped to his belt. If something or someone was out there, he intended to face it head-on. But the silence remained unbroken, and after a few tense moments, Jack forced himself to keep moving. The cub, meanwhile, stayed perfectly still, its sensors detecting the rise in Jack's heart rate and adrenaline levels. It calculated the probability of danger based on environmental factors and concluded that intervention was not yet required. For now, it would continue to follow, silent and unseen. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack had reached the edge of a massive crater. At its center lay the remains of the research facility, half buried beneath layers of sand and debris. The sight filled him with both relief and apprehension. He had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. Taking a deep breath, Jack descended into the crater, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Behind him, the cub paused momentarily, its glowing eyes reflecting the first rays of sunlight. Then, with a quiet whir, it resumed its pursuit, maintaining its 10-step distance. Neither Jack nor the cub knew what awaited them inside the facility, but both were prepared to face whatever came next. Jack stood at the edge of the massive crater, staring down at the ruins of the research facility. The structure was barely recognizable as a building anymore, its walls cracked and crumbling, its roof partially collapsed. Sand had drifted into the lower levels, filling hallways and rooms like a slow-moving tide. It looked like something out of an old nightmare, a place forgotten by time and left to rot. He took a deep breath, adjusted his oxygen mask, and began the descent. Each step sent tiny avalanches of dirt cascading down the steep slope, but Jack moved carefully, keeping his balance. By the time he reached the bottom, sweat trickled down his temples despite the cold morning air. He wiped it away with the back of his gloved hand and approached the entrance. The main door was gone, torn off its hinges long ago and lying in pieces nearby. Jack stepped inside cautiously, the beam of his helmet lamp cutting through the thick darkness. Dust hung in the air like a fog, swirling gently in the wake of his movements. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and twisted fragments of metal. Everything smelled faintly of rust and decay. As he moved deeper into the facility, Jack noticed signs of a hasty evacuation. Papers were scattered everywhere, some yellowed with age, others crumpled as if they'd been thrown aside in panic. Desks were overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied. Whatever had happened here, the people who worked in this place hadn't had time to pack up properly. They'd run for their lives. Jack's boots crunched against the floor as he explored one room after another. Most were empty or filled with useless junk, but every now and then he found something interesting. A computer terminal covered in dust, a stack of notebooks sealed in plastic bags, even a few tools that might still be functional. None of it seemed particularly valuable, though. He needed data, not random scraps of history. Eventually, he came across a large chamber that appeared to have been some kind of lab. Rows of workstations lined the walls, their screens black and lifeless. In the center of the room stood a massive machine, its purpose unclear. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting various components in a chaotic web. Jack frowned as he examined it, running his fingers over the smooth surface of the control panel. Something about it felt wrong, off. He turned on his wrist-mounted scanner, hopping to detect any residual energy readings. The device hummed softly as it analyzed the environment, but before it could finish, a loud creak echoed through the room. Jack froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned toward the sound, raising his knife instinctively. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing eerily in the vast space. There was no reply, just silence. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Jack scanned the room with his lamp, searching for movement. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering light, but nothing stirred. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Behind him, the cub remained perfectly still, hidden in the doorway. Its sensors detected subtle vibrations in the floor, indicating that something, or someone, was moving beneath them. It calculated the likelihood of danger and decided to stay put for now. Its programming dictated patience. It would only act when absolutely necessary. Jack shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. "Get it together," he muttered under his breath. Paranoia wouldn't help him get the job done. Focusing back on the task at hand, he returned to the control panel and pressed a few buttons experimentally. To his surprise, the machine sputtered to life, emitting a low hum that resonated through the chamber. A screen flickered on, displaying lines of text in a language Jack didn't recognize. Frustrated, he tapped the screen repeatedly, hopping to trigger some kind of translation function. Instead, the machine emitted a series of sharp beeps, followed by a burst of static. Jack cursed under his breath and stepped back, unsure whether he'd triggered a malfunction or activated something dangerous. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, plunging the space into near-total darkness. Jack's helmet lamp illuminated only a small area around him, leaving the rest of the chamber cloaked in shadow. His pulse quickened as he heard faint skittering sounds coming from somewhere above. He tilted his upward, scanning the ceiling. At first he saw nothing. Then something moved, a flash of pale skin, almost translucent, disappearing into the darkness just as quickly as it had appeared. Jack's grip tightened on his knife. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice sharper this time. Again there was no answer. Only the skittering continued, growing louder and closer. Jack backed away slowly, his eyes darting around the room. Whatever it was fast, and it was getting bolder. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught another glimpse of movement. This time, he swung his lamp in that direction, catching sight of what looked like a humanoid figure crouched on one of the workstations. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. For a brief moment their eyes met, or at least Jack thought they did. The creature's face was featureless, smooth and white like polished marble. Before Jack could react, the thing leapt down from its perch, landing silently on the floor. It didn't attack immediately, instead circling him slowly, its movements fluid and deliberate. Jack held his ground, his knife raised defensively. "Stay back," he warned, though he doubted the creature understood him. The cub, still concealed in the doorway, assessed the situation rapidly. Its internal systems processed hundreds of variables: the creature's speed, its size, its potential threat level. When the creature lunged suddenly, claws extended, the cub sprang into action without hesitation. With a burst of speed that belief, the mechanical wolf launched itself at the attacker, tackling it to the ground. The two figures tumbled together in a flurry of motion, the cub's metallic frame gleaming in the dim light. Sparks flew as the creature's claws scraped against the cub's armored body, but the robot didn't falter. It pinned the creature down, its jaws snapping shut mere inches from its face. Jack stared in shock, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He lowered his knife slightly, his breathing ragged. What is that?" he stammered, pointing at the cub. The cub didn't respond. It simply held the creature in place until it stopped struggling, then released it and stepped back. The creature screeched once, a high-pitched sound that made Jack's ears ring, before scrambling to its feet and retreating into the shadows. Within seconds, it was gone. Jack exhaled shakily, lowering his knife completely. He turned to look at the cub, which stood motionless, its glowing eyes fixed on him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice hoarse. "Where did you come from?" The cub didn't answer. It simply tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. Jack ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to handle anything on his own. But now, faced with undeniable proof that he wasn't alone, and that someone somewhere had sent help, he felt a strange mix of anger and gratitude. Shaking his head, Jack turned back to the control panel. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them standing around gawking at a robotic wolf. "Fine," he muttered under his breath. "You can tag along, but don't think this changes anything." The cub remained silent, watching as Jack resumed his work. Together, they continued exploring the facility, their steps echoing through the empty halls. Neither of them knew what dangers lay ahead, but one thing was certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together, even if Jack refused to admit it. Jack stood in the dimly lit chamber, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The encounter with the pale, spider-like creature had left him shaken, though he tried hard not to show it. He glanced at the cub, its metallic frame gleaming faintly under the light of his helmet lamp. Its glowing eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, watching him intently. For a moment Jack considered saying something, demanding answers or expressing his frustration, but he stopped himself. What was the point? The cub wasn't going to talk back. It was just a machine after all. A clever one, sure, but still just a tool designed to do a job. And yet, there was no denying that it had saved his life. That thought gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. Shaking off the unease, Jack turned his attention back to the control panel. Whatever secrets this place held, they weren't going to reveal themselves. He tapped a few buttons experimentally, hoping to coax some kind of response from the ancient system. To his relief, the screen flickered again, displaying more text. This time, however, parts of it began translating automatically into English. The words were fragmented, incomplete, but enough to give Jack an idea of what had happened here. The researchers had been studying an alien organism, a living thing unlike anything humanity had ever encountered before. At first, they believed it could be harnessed for energy, a solution to their dwindling resources. But the organism proved far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. It consumed everything it touched, spreading uncontrollably until the entire team was forced to abandon the facility. Jack frowned as he read. Something about the description felt wrong. The organism wasn't just consuming matter, it was adapting, evolving. The final entry on the screen sent a chill down his spine. Subject shows signs of mimicry, unable to determine original form. Before Jack could process the implications, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into near-total darkness. His heart skipped a beat as the skittering sounds returned, louder this time. They came from all around him now, echoing off the walls like whispers. Jack spun around, his knife raised defensively, but the shadows remained stubbornly empty. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "Just great." The cub moved closer, positioning itself between Jack and the source of the noise. Its sensors detected multiple heat signatures moving rapidly through the vents above. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't alone, and they were getting bolder. Jack backed away slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Without warning, one of the creatures dropped down directly in front of him, landing with a sickening thud. It was smaller than the first one he'd seen, its body sleek and sinewy almost. Its blank face tilted unnaturally, studying him with cold indifference. Jack reacted instantly, slashing at the creature with his knife. The blade glanced off its skin, leaving only a shallow scratch. The creature hissed angrily, lunging forward with startling speed. Jack barely managed to dodge, stumbling backward into the cub. For a brief second, he felt the warmth of the cub's metallic frame against his arm, a strange comfort in the chaos. The cub didn't hesitate. With a burst of movement too fast for the eye to follow, it tackled the creature, slamming it into the wall with enough force to crack the concrete. The impact stunned the creature momentarily, giving Jack time to regain his footing. He glanced around nervously, searching for any sign of reinforcements. As if on cue, two more creatures emerged from the shadows, their movements eerily synchronized. Jack tightened his grip on his knife, knowing full well that he couldn't take them all on by himself. The cub seemed to sense his dilemma. With a low growl-like hum, it positioned itself protectively in front of him, its glowing eyes narrowing as it prepared for another attack. The fight was over almost as quickly as it began. The cub moved with mechanical precision, striking each creature with calculated efficiency. Within moments, all three lay motionless on the floor, their bodies twitching faintly before going still. Jack stared at them, his mind racing. These things were fast, strong, and relentless, but they weren't invincible. Still, the victory felt hollow. Jack knew they couldn't keep fighting like this indefinitely. Sooner or later, they'd run out of luck or stamina. He needed to find a way out of this place and fast. Turning back to the control panel, Jack scrolled through the remaining files, looking for anything useful. Most of the data was corrupted or incomplete, but one file caught his attention. It contained schematics of the facility, including a map of the underground tunnels that connected different sections. According to the notes, the tunnels were originally used for maintenance access, but had been sealed off during the evacuation. Jack's eyes narrowed. If those tunnels were still intact, they might provide a way to bypass whatever was hunting them. It was risky, but staying put wasn't an option either. He glanced at the cub, which stood silently beside him, waiting for instructions. "Looks like we've got a new plan," he said, pointing at the map. "We're heading underground." The journey to the tunnel entrance was tense. Every step felt like walking into a trap, every sound like the prelude to another ambush. The cub stayed close, its sensors constantly scanning for threats. More than once, Jack caught glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision, but nothing attacked. Not yet, anyway. When they finally reached the tunnel entrance, Jack hesitated. The door was heavy and rusted, its hinges groaning loudly as he pushed it open. Beyond it lay a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The air inside was stale and damp, carrying the faint smell of mildew. Jack switched on his helmet lamp, illuminating the path ahead. The cub slipped past him effortlessly, taking the lead without being asked. Jack followed closely behind, his knife still clutched tightly in his hand. The tunnel sloped downward gradually, twisting and turning as it descended deeper beneath the facility. Every so often, they passed rooms filled with old equipment, generators, storage tanks, even a small medical bay, but none of it looked functional anymore. After what felt like hours, they reached a junction where the tunnel split into two directions. Jack consulted the map again, trying to figure out which way to go. Before he could decide, the cub froze, its ears perking up slightly. A low rumble echoed through the tunnel, growing louder with each passing second. "What now?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. The answer came soon enough. From the left branch of the tunnel, a swarm of creatures poured forth, their pale bodies writhing like snakes. There were too many to count, their numbers overwhelming. Jack cursed under his breath, backing away instinctively. Even the cub seemed uncertain for a moment, its glowing eyes darting back and forth as it calculated the odds. "Right it is," Jack said grimly, turning toward the other branch. The cub followed immediately, matching his pace as they sprinted down the corridor. Behind them, the creatures gave chase, their screeches reverberating through the confined space. The tunnel narrowed further as they ran, forcing them to duck and weave around obstacles. Jack's lungs burned with exertion, his legs aching from the constant strain. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the horde closing in, their unnatural speed making escape seem impossible. Then, just as hope began to fade, the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber. In the center of the room stood a massive airlock door, its surface marked with faded warning symbols. Jack didn't need to read them to know what they meant. Beyond this point lay something dangerous, something that hadn't been fully contained. Without hesitation, Jack punched in the code from the map, praying it would work. The door hissed open with a loud clang, revealing a short hallway leading to another set of doors. He stepped inside, the cub right behind him, and slammed the button to seal the entrance. The creatures collided with the door moments later, their weight shaking the entire structure. Jack leaned against the wall, gasping for breath as he watched the barrier hold firm, for now. He glanced at the cub, whose glowing eyes reflected his own exhaustion. "We're not done yet," Jack said quietly, pushing himself upright. "But we're alive, for now." The cub didn't respond, but its presence was enough. Together, they pressed onward, ready to face whatever awaited them next. Jack stood in the narrow hallway beyond the airlock, his breathing heavy and uneven. The sounds of the creatures pounding against the door behind them were muffled but still audible, a constant reminder that their reprieve was temporary. He glanced at the cub, its glowing eyes steady and unwavering. If machines could feel calm, Jack thought bitterly, this one certainly did. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights embedded in the ceiling. The walls were lined with pipes and cables, some of which hummed faintly with residual energy. At the far end, another door loomed, marked with the same faded warning symbols as the previous one. Jack didn't need to guess what lay beyond it. It would be another layer of danger, another challenge to survive. He adjusted his grip on his knife and took a step forward. His legs felt like lead, weighed down not just by exhaustion, but also by the growing realization that he couldn't do this alone. Not really. Every time he tried to push the thought away, the image of the cub stepping between him and those creatures came back to haunt him. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to handle anything life threw at him. But now, faced with undeniable proof that he needed help, he felt a strange mix of anger and shame. "Why are you even here?" Jack muttered under his breath, glancing at the cub. "Who sent you?" The question hung in the air unanswered, as expected. The cub simply followed, its metallic paws making no sound against the cold metal floor. Jack shook his head, trying to focus on the task at hand. Whatever was waiting for them beyond the next door, they had to face it together, or not at all. When they reached the end of the hallway, Jack hesitated before punching in the code from the map. He knew opening the door meant stepping into unknown territory, possibly triggering something worse than the swarm of creatures outside. Still, staying put wasn't an option. With a deep breath, he pressed the button, and the door slid open with a groan. The room beyond was vast and cavernous, its ceiling lost in shadow. Rows of tanks filled with a viscous green liquid dominated the space, each one connected to a network of tubes and wires. Inside the tanks floated shapes that description, twisted, amorphous forms that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Jack's stomach churned as he realized what he was looking at. The organism the researchers had been studying, preserved, or perhaps contained in these tanks. "This is insane," Jack whispered, taking a cautious step forward. His helmet lamp illuminated one of the tanks more clearly, revealing details that made his skin crawl. The creature inside was neither solid nor liquid. It seemed to shift and change shape constantly, its surface rippling like water disturbed by wind. Tiny tendrils extended outward, brushing against the glass as if testing its limits. The cub moved closer to the tank, its sensors analyzing the contents. A low hum emanated from its body as it processed the data. Jack watched it warily, unsure whether it was about to intervene or simply observe. After a moment, the cub stepped back, its glowing eyes fixed on Jack. Whatever it had detected, it wasn't good. Before Jack could react, a loud crack echoed through the room. One of the tanks near the far wall shattered, spilling its contents onto the floor. The green liquid spread rapidly, pooling around the base of other tanks and causing cracks to form in their surfaces. Jack backed away instinctively, his mind racing. If the organisms escaped, There would be no stopping them. The first tank exploded violently, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. Jack ducked, covering his head with his arms as the shockwave knocked him off balance. When he looked up again, he saw the creature emerging from the wreckage, a writhing mass of tendrils and flesh that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. It lashed out blindly, destroying nearby tanks and freeing more of its kind. "We have to move," Jack shouted, though he knew the cub wouldn't respond. He turned and ran toward the opposite side of the room, searching for an exit. The cub followed closely, weaving through the chaos with eerie precision. Behind them, the organisms converged, merging into a single, monstrous entity. Its size was staggering, filling the entire room with its grotesque bulk. Tendrils shot out in every direction, smashing equipment and tearing apart walls. Jack risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. The thing was gaining on them, its movements unnervingly fast despite its size. At the far end of the room, Jack spotted a staircase leading upward. Without hesitation, he bolted toward it, taking the steps two at a time. The cub stayed right behind him, its mechanical frame surprisingly agile. They reached the top just as the creature slammed into the base of the stairs, causing the entire structure to shake violently. Jack stumbled into a narrow corridor, slamming the door shut behind them. He braced himself against it, panting heavily. "That won't hold it for long," he muttered, scanning the area for another way out. The corridor was lined with lockers and supply crates, offering little protection. At the far end, however, he spotted an emergency ladder leading to the surface. "We're almost there," Jack said, half to himself and half to the cub. He started moving again, his pace quickening as the sounds of destruction grew louder behind them. The door trembled under the weight of the creature's assault, bending inward slightly with each impact. The cub positioned itself between Jack and the door, its stance defensive. Though it couldn't speak, its actions conveyed a clear message: keep going. Jack nodded grimly and continued toward the ladder, climbing as fast as his weary muscles would allow. By the time he reached the surface, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape. Jack collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The cub emerged moments later, standing silently beside him. For a long while, neither of them moved, simply listening to the distant rumble of the facility collapsing beneath them. Finally, Jack sat up, wiping sweat from his brow. "We made it," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? The facility was gone, along with whatever secrets it held, and the creature, Jack shuddered at the thought of it escaping into the wild. As they began the long trek back to the colony, Jack couldn't help but glance at the cub occasionally. Its presence was a reminder of how close he'd come to failure, and how much he owed to someone who cared enough to send help, even if he hadn't asked for it. "You saved my life," Jack admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Guess I can't say I handled this alone." The cub didn't respond, but its glowing eyes seemed to soften slightly, as if acknowledging the rare admission. Together they walked on, the red dust swirling around their feet as the wind carried whispers of the dangers left behind. Jack trudged across the barren expanse of Seven, his boots kicking up clouds of red dust with each heavy step. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked and lifeless terrain. Behind him, the cub followed silently, its metallic frame gleaming faintly in the pale light. They were both battered and worn from their ordeal in the facility, but neither showed any sign of slowing down. The journey back to the colony was far from over, and Jack knew they couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. Every so often, Jack glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see some remnant of the creature chasing them. But the horizon remained empty, save for the endless stretch of desolation. Still, the memory of that monstrous entity lingered in his mind, haunting him like a ghost. He had seen things no human should ever witness, and he wasn't sure he'd ever be able to forget them. As they walked, Jack found himself thinking about, she must have known what she was doing when she sent the cub after him. Maybe she hadn't trusted him to make it back alive, or maybe she just cared too much to let him face the mission alone. Either way, her decision had saved his life. For all his stubbornness, Jack couldn't deny that he owed her, and the cub, a debt he could never repay. "Guess I misjudged you," Jack muttered under his breath, glancing at the cub. "Didn't think I needed help, but well, here we are." The cub didn't respond, of course. It simply continued walking, its glowing eyes fixed ahead. Jack shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth despite everything. There was something oddly comforting about the machine's unwavering presence. It didn't question him, didn't argue. It just did what it was built to do, without hesitation or complaint. By the time they reached the outskirts of the colony, night had fallen once again. The cluster of domes and prefab structures stood out against the darkness, their lights flickering faintly like stars in the void. Jack quickened his pace, eager to put the horrors of the past few days behind him. As they approached the perimeter fence, the gates slid open automatically, revealing Standing on the other side. Her expression shifted rapidly as she took in the sight of Jack, dirty, exhausted, but alive. Relief washed over her face, quickly followed by anger. "You're an idiot, you know that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you have any idea how worried I was?" Jack stopped a few feet away, leaning heavily on his knees as he caught his breath. "Yeah, I get it," he replied, his tone softer than usual. "And thanks for sending the cub." Blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected gratitude. "You're welcome," she said finally, crossing her arms over her chest. "But don't think this means I'm letting you go off on your own again anytime soon." Jack chuckled weakly, straightening up. "Fair enough." Behind him, the cub stepped forward, its glowing eyes dimming slightly as it powered down. Stared at it for a moment, then turned her attention back to Jack. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Jack hesitated, glancing toward the cub before answering. "Not exactly," he admitted. "The facility's gone. Whatever secrets it held are buried under rubble now. And there's something else out there, something dangerous." His brow furrowed. "What kind of something?" Jack shook his head. "Something big. Something we can't fight, not without more resources anyway. We need to fortify the colony, prepare for the worst. If that thing gets loose." He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid, nodded slowly, her expression grim. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. "Together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack didn't argue. Instead, he gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth in her words. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to handle anything on his own. But the events of the past few days had taught him a hard lesson. Even the strongest people needed help sometimes. As they made their way into the colony, Jack allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The cub followed silently, its sensors scanning the area for any signs of danger. Though its body bore scratches and dents from their battle, it showed no signs of slowing down. It would continue to do its job, protecting and assisting, until the day it ceased to function. Jack stopped briefly outside the maintenance bay, watching as the cub disappeared inside. Its glowing eyes faded completely as it powered down, leaving only silence in its wake. For a moment, Jack felt a pang of gratitude, not just for the machine itself, but for the person who had sent it. Inside, the command center was already coordinating efforts to strengthen the colony's defenses. Maps and schematics covered the walls, and teams of engineers worked tirelessly to reinforce the perimeter. Jack joined her, offering suggestions based on what he'd seen in the facility. Together, they devised a plan to ensure the colony's survival. If the creature ever came knocking, they would be ready. Hours later, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, Jack stepped outside once more. The air was cold and still, the wind barely stirring the dust at his feet. He looked out across the wasteland, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. It had been a harrowing journey, one that had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But he had survived, and not entirely on his own. Glancing back at the maintenance bay, Jack spotted the cub resting quietly in the corner. Its metallic frame blended seamlessly with the shadows, almost invisible in the early morning light. Jack smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Guess you proved me wrong," he murmured. "Maybe I can't handle everything alone after all." With that, he turned and walked back toward the colony, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The road wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of hope. He wasn't alone, and that made all the difference.